It was 5:30 in the evening, and my wife of 19 years, Elaine, had neither arrived home from work nor called. She was almost always home before 5, as her hours as executive assistant to Janice Farrell of Farrell International were 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Elaine had been in her position with Michael Farrell before his death 2 years earlier, and when his daughter, Janice, took over the reins, she had kept Elaine on as her personal assistant. Our son, Tommy, was already home from school and upstairs in his room, cramming in his homework so he could enjoy some quality time in front of the TV after dinner. By 5:45, I was getting worried and called Elaine's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I had just left her a message to call me when she came through the door carrying several bags from Antonio's Italian restaurant. On the way to the kitchen, she gave me a peck on the cheek, saying as she went, "Sorry, honey, I had to stay a little late and I didn't take anything out of the freezer for dinner, so I stopped at Antonio's. Hope that's okay?" "Sure," I said, but I was getting worried. "Why didn't you call?" "I forgot to charge my phone last night, and when I got in my car to call you, I realized it was dead." One of my few pet peeves with Elaine was that her phone was usually either off, dead, or silenced, so I could almost never get hold of her when she was out. When I'd complain, she'd always tell me, "You're right, hon. I'll make it a point to do better." She would remember for a few days, but then it was back to normal. Frustrating, but something I've learned to live with. Elaine was in an ebullient mood during dinner, but the conversation was dominated by our 7th grade son, who was excited about upcoming baseball tryouts and how unfair his math teacher, Mrs. Fielding, was with the amount of homework that she assigned. We always allowed Tommy to monopolize the TV until his 9 p.m. bedtime, but we had made a decision early on that he was not going to have a television in his room, a fact that he frequently bemoaned. There was no television in our room either, since it might distract us from our primary reason for being there, either sleep or sex. The latter we managed at least 4 times a week, so we were an anomaly amongst our friends and neighbors, being a 1 TV family. Some were so addicted to the tube that they even had one in the kitchen. Since a little biographical information about us, Joe and Elaine Sullivan, might add some context to the story, I'll start with me. I retired last year at 50 years old, and a patrol sergeant with the county police department. Thanks to the state retirement system, which allowed military veterans to buy back their service time to add to their police retirement time, I was able to apply my 4 years as an Army Ranger toward my 25-year retirement requirement. Basically, what that meant was that I, and other military vets, had the option of paying into the retirement system the same amount of money that the county would have to contribute and apply that time to the retirement years. The rigors of police work and the physicality of my part-time job left my 5 feet 11 inches frame with very little body fat. In the time since I retired, I have turned my part-time handyman job into a full-time contracting business. With the connections I had made over the years doing small home improvement jobs, I don't need to advertise. My reputation for excellent work has preceded itself, and recommendations ensure a constant flow of work. My wife Elaine, who will be 45 years old next month, was 25 when we married, and being 31 at the time myself, I had just started my police career. The details of our courtship are not relevant. Suffice it to say that we met at a mutual friend's party, and I was immediately smitten. She had, and still has, shoulder-length wavy brown hair, blue eyes, a captivating smile, and at 5 feet 8 inches is still the same size 8 as when we met. Aside from her pretty face and alluring figure, I think it was her effervescent personality that really hooked me. My wife can be a little naive when it relates to people's modus operandi, but that may just be the cynical nature that most cops develop over a period of time. As an executive assistant to a mid-sized international company, she makes a good salary, and combined with my increased income as a private contractor, we are financially comfortable. As best friends, we also respect one another and our marriage, and our relationship has always been an equal partnership. We share parental responsibilities, cooking, and household chores. Of course, certain tasks are gender-related. She doesn't do yard maintenance, and I don't go near her laundry room. I learned that lesson the hard way when trying to be a helpful husband. I ruined several of her good blouses by not having a firm grasp of color sorting. Our son Tommy had gone to the living room to get his daily dose of TV, and I was helping Elaine clear the table and load the dishwasher. Normally, after cleaning up the kitchen, we would have coffee before going into the den to either talk or read. This night was no different, and as my wife put a cup of coffee in front of me, she casually said, "Connie got a promotion to head up our London office, and if it's all right with you, we were planning to go out to dinner and do a little dancing tomorrow night." To be honest, I didn't pay much attention to Elaine's friends from work, so I didn't remember Connie, but not wanting to sound disinterested, I didn't mention that fact. The dancing part did get my attention, and I did question that part. She replied cheerily, "We both love to dance, and I rarely get the chance. Since you hate to dance, and by your own admission were born with 2 left feet, so you'll just be dancing together." I asked questioningly. Of course, she replied, and it will only be for a few hours. I'll be home by 11. I wasn't thrilled, but since she never went out with the girls like a lot of our friends' wives do, I acquiesced. The following evening when Elaine got home from work, she asked what I had planned for dinner for Tommy and myself. Chicken pot pies. I said with some authority. My son and I love pot pies, but Elaine hated them and always lectured me about the unhealthy sodium content and the high calorie count. She frowned at my answer, but shook her head in defeat. Connie is picking me up at 7, she said, so I'm going upstairs to shower and change while you guys are poisoning yourselves. The next day was Saturday, so Tommy had gone to his friend Jason's house with the admonition to be home for dinner by 7:30, when the pot pies would be done. At 6:50 the doorbell rang. Expecting to see Elaine's girlfriend, when I opened the door, I was surprised to see a well-dressed man of about 35, tall with blonde wavy hair. The first thought that entered my head was that he was a salesman, or worse, a Jehovah's Witness, but I recalled that the Jehovah's always traveled in pairs. He dispelled both of my assumptions when he extended his hand and said, "Hi, you must be Joe. Elaine talks about you all of the time." As I confusedly accepted his hand, he stepped around me and through the threshold. Seeing my confusion and displaying a brilliant white smile, he said, "Oh, perhaps you don't remember me. We met briefly at the office Christmas party. I'm Conrad Hunter. I must thank you for allowing me to escort Elaine this evening. I guess she told you that I'm leaving this coming week to head up our London office, and your wife has been such an invaluable asset to me these past 2 years that I wanted to show my appreciation." All this was said in a matter of a few seconds, but his eyes seemed to be evaluating me, and the words were spoken with a hint of superiority and condescension. My wits finally returning, I said, "Well, Conrad, there must." "Call me Connie," he said cheerily. "Everybody does." "Hey, a house doesn't have to fall on me." I finally made the connection, so I continued more forcefully. "Well, Connie, I think there may have been some miscommunication here. Give me a moment while I speak to my wife." I climbed the stairs quickly, but with as much dignity as a potential cuck could manage. When I entered our bedroom, Elaine had just finishing arranging her dress and was examining herself in a full-length mirror. She was wearing a black cocktail dress that, while not looking risque, was by no means conservative. She grabbed her red leather clutch, which matched her 4-inch red high heels, and turning to me with a smile, said, "I heard the doorbell. I guess that is Connie. How do I look?" I didn't reply, but the look of anger and incredulity on my face must have prompted her to ask, "What's up, Joe? You look perturbed." "Perturbed?" I shouted. "My wife wants to go out on a date with some young hunk who wants to make me his cuck. So, no, I'm not perturbed. I'm astonished. I'm pissed and embarrassed that there is a man waiting downstairs in my house, waiting for my wife to accompany him for a romantic evening, and unless he's gay, it's with the intention of getting into your pants." When her hands went to her hips, I knew that the conversation was not over, and it was not going to go well. I could tell by the lack of an immediate reply that she was calming herself, readying for a verbal assault. With about as much anger in her voice as I have ever witnessed, she finally spoke. "Well, Joe, I am the one who is astonished and pissed. First of all, you have all but accused me of being a 304, thinking that I would allow another man to seduce and have sex with me. Your insinuation is more than insulting, it is hurtful. Secondly, I have worked with Connie for 2 years, and he has always conducted himself as a perfect gentleman. He has never, and I mean never, hit on me or said one inappropriate word." Then grabbing her purse and moving towards the door, added forcefully, "I am not going to keep him standing by himself while you make a fool of yourself. I will be home around 11, and hopefully you will have gotten your head out of your butt by then." I stood there flabbergasted as I watched her descend the stairs. Now from Elaine's side, I can't ever remember being so angry. Joe and I have a marriage based on mutual love and trust, and I couldn't believe what my husband of 19 years had just implied. Apparently the respect and trust that I thought we enjoyed was one-sided. Connie could obviously sense that I was upset as I gave him a kiss on the cheek. He asked if everything was all right. I forced a smile and replied, "Absolutely. Are we ready?" I glanced back up the stairs as Connie put his hand on the small of my back and guided me through the door to his car. Back to Joe. I was standing at the top of the landing as I watched my wife reach her head up, kiss her date, and her glancing up at me momentarily with what I perceived as a smirk. He then put his arm around her waist and ushered her through the door. The anger that I was feeling was not only at Elaine but at myself for not having been more insistent that she not go out, and that if she did she was disrespecting our marriage and putting our relationship at risk. As I contemplated yesterday's conversation when she told me of her intention to go to dinner and dancing with a colleague, I now wondered if she intentionally did not use the words he, him, and his, just the name Connie. It seems unlikely that someone could avoid using at least one of those pronouns, which I have to suspect was an intentional ploy to deceive me. Surely, she didn't expect me to remember a 5-second introduction at a crowded office party almost a year ago. Meanwhile, Elaine was in a car with Conrad. In the car, Connie was making small talk, but I was still so upset with Joe that I didn't hear most of what he was saying. I realized my mind had wandered when he asked, "Well, what do you think?" "Oh, Connie," I said. "I'm sorry, my mind drifted for a moment." "It's okay," he replied. "I asked you what you thought of having dinner at the Chop House. It's at the Marriott and there is a good dance club there." Forcibly pushing my recent marital conflict from my mind, I replied. "That sounds lovely. I've never been there, but I've heard good things about it." He looked at me questioningly and, reaching over to squeeze my hand, which was resting on my thigh, asked, "Is everything okay, hon? You seemed upset when you came downstairs, and the brief encounter I had with your husband led me to believe he was not on board with our date." The use of the words hon and date, as well as his squeezing my hand, did not escape my notice, but really didn't raise any red flags. After all, I've known this man for 2 years, and a lot of men call their lady friends hon and the word date. Well, I guess in a vague way it was, but not the way Joe was interpreting it. "You're right. I assumed that Joe remembered you from the party, especially since he had innocently asked later that evening who I had been dancing with." Thinking back, I may not have used the name Connie and perhaps said Conrad. I just don't remember. I guess when you showed up, he just then realized that Connie was not the girlfriend he had been expecting and got the wrong impression. "Listen, hon," he said sympathetically, "if you want to change your mind about this evening, I will certainly understand. I'll certainly be disappointed because not only do you look fantastic, but I was looking forward to a couple of hours on the dance floor with you." "Absolutely not," I said, possibly more vehemently than I had intended. "I am looking forward to a nice dinner and enjoying your dancing skills, which I must say are prodigious. Unfortunately, Joe has 2 left feet and only does a couple of obligatory dances with me when we are out." I didn't want to put Connie off, so I said with a coy smile and a coquettish voice, "However, I am a married woman and I did promise to be home by midnight. I'm yours till then." I did remember that I told Joe 11, but that's before he pissed me off. Connie awarded me with his dazzling smile, and this time reaching over and briefly touching my knee, said, "Good. Let's just go and have a good time, and I'll make sure to get Cinderella home before the stroke of 12. Back home, Joe was with his son. Tommy and I ate our pot pies, but for the first time I didn't enjoy mine. My son asked what time his mom would be home since he had already been told by me that she was going out to dinner with a girlfriend. I saw no reason to embarrass myself by explaining that his stupid father had allowed his mother to go on a date with a man. That's exactly how I thought of myself, a stupid cuck, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Tom's bedtime was extended by 1 hour on weekends, so normally this would be a 10 o'clock night, but frankly, I didn't want to be sitting alone staring at the 4 walls waiting for my wife to come home, so I gave him an extra hour. However, at 11 I sent him off to bed with a hug. He was too old now to give a kiss. I knew it embarrassed him. I took up my post in the living room, watching a muted television and waiting to hear a car in the driveway. My anger had only increased and I intended to have a serious talk with Elaine when she returned. I was sure their relationship was professional, but a married woman does not go out dining and dancing with another man. At least not my married woman. I did trust Elaine despite what I had said earlier, but I didn't trust that prick that she went out with. Maybe it was my cop instinct or just the instinct of a jealous husband with an attractive wife. Either way, his gentlemanly facade could not disguise the wolf behind his eyes, and I just hoped that my Red Riding Hood would not be fooled by the sheep's clothing. At 11:30 I resisted the urge to call Elaine's cell, but by 11:45 I could resist no longer. I was aware that her first statement of home by 11 had morphed into around 11. However, I fully expected her to answer and tell me she was on her way, but once again the call went to voicemail and I did not leave a message. Since the call had gone immediately to voicemail, her phone must have been intentionally turned off, which only served to further fuel my anger. Meanwhile, Elaine was enjoying her date. We had a wonderful dinner at the Chop House, preceded by a couple of Cosmos for me and some beer for Connie. I can't say I wasn't enamored by his compliments about how lucky my husband was to have such a beautiful, charming, and sexy wife. When I mentioned my age in conversation, he further boosted my ego by telling me that he just assumed I had married an older man and that I didn't look a day over 35. Women love flattery, and I was certainly no exception. I had all but forgotten my little tiff with Joe and was looking forward to getting on the dance floor with Connie. The band was exceptional, and we danced almost continuously for an hour. The only times we sat were when a slow song started to play, and I discreetly moved us off the floor. When the band went on break, I excused myself to go to the ladies' room, and when I returned, Connie had a fresh Cosmo waiting for me and a beer for himself. I was thirsty from dancing and probably drank it faster than I normally would because when the band resumed playing and we hit the dance floor again, I felt a little woozy. A few songs into their set, a slow number began, and I didn't resist when Connie took me in his arms. That number was followed by another slow tune, and I was actually grateful to hold on to him since the effects of that last drink left me unsteady on my feet and a bit dizzy. Seeing my distress, Connie suggested that we sit out a few numbers. I had hardly noticed that he had his hand on mine, but as he guided us to our booth, or the fact that he sat next to me instead of across from me as he had been doing previously. Back home, Joe was now getting impatient. By 1 a.m., I had called Elaine's phone 5 times and had left 3 messages, the last message being, "Elaine, if this about punishing me, I get your point, but I expect you to call me back immediately. If I don't hear from you within the next half hour, I will be going to bed and setting the deadbolt so you can spend the night with your lover, knowing you have destroyed a great marriage and a happy family." I was well beyond pissed, and my imagination was starting to play havoc with me. 1:30 came and went, but I did not go to bed. I sat in the living room doubting if I would have a marriage in the morning. Meanwhile, Elaine was with Conrad. I felt Connie's hand leave mine and slowly start to caress the inside of my thigh, but I felt powerless to move even though I knew I was getting aroused. I tried to speak, but even my ability to formulate words was affected, and I was embarrassed that I had gotten so drunk. Part of my brain was telling me to stop this, but another part of me was enjoying. At some point, I vaguely recall a disjointed voice speaking to me, and then a strong hand helping me out of the booth. I remember the voice saying, "Honey, I think you should lay down for a while. You look a little under the weather." There was an arm around me holding me upright and guiding me somewhere. I sort of remember being in an elevator, but not knowing where I was going. When I entered a strange room, there was a bed, and I knew I needed to lay down. I wasn't tired, but my limbs were unresponsive and my mind confused. I heard some indistinguishable soothing words, and then Joe's lips were on mine. Soon, I could feel the cold air hitting my exposed body. From the corner of my eyes, I could see my clothes lying in a heap on the floor. He just got on top of me and took me. Then my eyes closed automatically. When I managed to open my eyes slightly, I saw a face with blue eyes staring into mine as he continued to have sex with me. Not Joe. Not Joe. My mind was screaming, but no words escaped my lips. As my mouth opened, my body shook with a powerful climax. Meanwhile, Joe was now in panic mode. At 5 a.m., after several more unanswered calls, I finally laid on my bed and fell into an exhausted, fitful sleep, certain of the knowledge that our marriage was over. Short of a catastrophic event, there could be no excuse that I would accept nor any forgive her for this blatant betrayal. Just after 7 a.m., my phone rang, and thinking it was Eileen, I was tempted not to answer it, since there was nothing she could say to undo the damage she had caused. However, looking at the caller ID, I saw that it was a number that I didn't recognize, so I hit the accept button and groggily said hello. The voice on the other end asked, "Is this Joe? Joe Sullivan?" As I acknowledged that it was, I got a sick feeling in my stomach that maybe someone was calling to advise me of that catastrophic event that I hadn't seriously considered just a few hours before. The voice continued, "Joe, this is Terry Connor. Remember me?" Terry had been one of the newer patrol officers under my supervision when I had retired. He was an ex-Marine and a good cop, more savvy and streetwise than some of his peers that had not seen military service. "Of course, Terry," I replied, the worry obvious in my voice. "What's the matter?" He seemed to hesitate, but finally asked, "Is your wife home?" I started to fear the worst when I answered, "No, she went out to dinner with a colleague and was supposed to be home by 11 last night. I have been unable to reach her. All of my calls have gone to voicemail." "Is she all right?" I asked in a shaky voice. "Yes and no, Joe. She's at Mercy Hospital. She came to the ER of her own accord claiming that she had been sexually assaulted. I caught the call, but all she would tell was her name and that her husband had been a cop and she wouldn't talk to anybody but you. She doesn't have any visible physical injuries, but the docs did some blood tests and are testing her with sexual assault kit. I'm sorry to be the one to have to tell, but I think you should get down here as soon as possible. I'm going to have to call this into the Dicks, but I wanted to give you a heads up. How long before you can get here?" 15 minutes, was my abrupt reply. "Okay, Joe, I'd normally have to go back on patrol once the Dicks arrived, but I'll stall for a while, so you can get here before they do." "Thanks, Terry," I said sincerely. "I'll get there quick as I can." My first thought was, I'm going to kill that maggot. I didn't want to wake Tommy, but I couldn't have him wake up in an empty house not knowing what was happening. I went to his room and gently shook him awake, saying, "Listen, son, wake up." He rubbed his eyes and seemed disoriented, but I continued quickly, since I had very little time. "Tommy, Mom was involved in a minor traffic accident. She's okay, but is being checked out at the hospital as a precaution, so I have to go down there with the insurance information. I just didn't want you to wake up to an empty house. Like I said, she's fine, no cuts, no broken bones, so don't worry. Go back to sleep. I'll be back soon." His face had a look of concern, but he mumbled, "Okay, Dad," and laid his head back down. My hands were shaking so much I had trouble putting the key in the ignition. Meanwhile, Elaine was in her thoughts at the hospital. When I woke, it was because of an urgent need to defecate, but I was still confused and disoriented. The room was dark with the only dim illumination emanating from the bathroom nightlight. I slipped out of bed and made my way towards the light. My brain was starting to clear, enough so that I knew that I was not in my own home. Sitting on the bowl, I realized that it wasn't an urge to go that woke me. It was pain in my rectum. Because when I wiped myself, I saw traces of blood on the toilet paper, and that's when I realized I had been done in there. As I continued to sit on the bowl, images of the previous evening started to trickle into my consciousness, and the thought of what I had probably been subjected to made me nauseous, and I started to retch. I barely had time to spin around and fall to my knees as the vomiting began. When there was nothing left in my stomach to spew into the bowl, I stood leaning on the bathroom vanity, staring at a woman I hardly recognized. My eyes were bloodshot, bite marks on shoulder and neck, and my hair matted and stiff in places that could only be drying semen. The shame and guilt washed over me as quickly as a rogue wave at the beach can knock you down and pull you under. I couldn't bear to look any longer at the woman in the mirror. She didn't reflect the image of the confident, happy wife and loving mother that should have been staring back at me. Still leaning on the counter, my head sagged and my tears began. When I was finally able to look up again at the ugly image before me, I knew that my naive stupidity and intractable stubbornness had cost me my own self-respect, the loss of my husband, and probably the respect of my son. If I had had a knife or a gun at my disposal, I would have killed the son of a bitch that had stolen my life for his selfish sexual gratification. How could I have gotten this drunk? I thought. But as I ruminated about what the things I could remember, I recalled that I had only had 3 drinks, 2 in the restaurant and 1 in the club. Maybe that was enough for a little buzz, but certainly not enough to make me lose control. He drugged me. I said it out loud. That rotten maggot had put something in my drink. I knew what I wanted to do when I entered the room and saw him there sleeping naked on his back. Thoughts of clawing his eyes out, ripping his balls off, and biting his tool off ran through my mind. But I knew I didn't have the physical prowess to accomplish that. I knew what I had to do, and I quickly and quietly set out to accomplish just that. I got dressed quietly, and with a last look of utter hatred at a monster that I had once admired, I slipped out of the room. Meanwhile, Joe arrived at the hospital. It took me just under 15 minutes to arrive at the emergency room, and true to his word, Terry was waiting for me. Due to the early hour, there were very few people in the waiting room. "Where is she?" I almost demanded as I strode towards the curtained cubicles. Terry immediately stopped by putting a firm hand on my chest, saying, "Hold on, Joe, she's asleep." They gave her a sedative to calm her. She was pretty hysterical. "The detectives will be here in a few minutes. Use the time to get your story straight." "Story straight?" I said angrily. "What do you mean, story straight?" Terry still had the look and build of a Marine, and despite my own decent physical condition, he was 15 years younger and obviously stronger as he put his hand under my arm and, squeezing my bicep, led me to a corner away from any inquisitive ears. "Listen, Joe, I'm on your side here," he whispered. "I don't know your marital situation, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that at 4:15 this morning your wife arrived here by cab claiming that she had been assaulted. They're going to want to know where you were, how it was that she was not home with her family, who she was with, and how it was she came here obviously dressed for an evening out on the town." She wouldn't answer those questions when I posed them. All she would say was, "I won't talk to anyone but my husband." Out of respect for you, I didn't peruse the questioning, but the dicks certainly will. So all I'm saying is that you should have your thoughts together in order to possibly minimize the fallout to you and your family. Before I could thank Terry, 2 things happened simultaneously. 2 dicks arrived and the ER doc was approaching us. One of the detectives was male, and the other a female who I did not recognize. The guy I knew because we had been at many a crime scene together. His name is Harvey Berg, and he was an old school cop with about 30 years on the job. When Harvey saw the doctor approach me, he held back, and when the female cop kept walking, he put a hand on her shoulder and said something in a hushed tone. She did not look happy, but she stopped. The doctor asked if I was the patient's husband, and it did not escape my notice that he did not refer to me as the victim's husband. Terry had patted my back and was headed for the exit, and then the doctor spoke with a slight mid-Eastern accent. "Mr. Sullivan, I am Dr. Nadel. Your wife has no visible injuries, per se. I say visible because there was some tearing of her rectum, but that will not require surgical intervention and should heal fairly quickly. There are some bite marks, usually referred to as hickeys, on both breasts, but they do not require treatment either." My heart sank and a wave of dizziness washed through me as I pictured Elaine being screwed and her body mauled by that low-life maggot. "We did a sexual intercourse exam," the doc continued, "and there was semen in both her vagina and anus. There was also dried semen in her hair, indicating recent sexual activity. Blood was extracted to test for alcohol or drugs, but those results are not back yet. Of course, the evidence of semen in both cavities suggests recent sexual activity, and until the results of the blood tests are in, that is all I will be able to tell you or the investigators." I was getting pissed off with his use of words which suggested to me he was not convinced of the lack of consent. Sexual encounter was a far cry from sexual assault, but he continued. "Your wife has refused to answer any questions regarding the incident other than claiming that she was drugged before the incident and insisting on speaking only to you. At the moment, I don't see any reason to admit her, but I would like to delay her release until the blood workup is complete. Until then, I will be in a better position to make a final decision. She has been given a mild sedative to reduce her agitated state, but she is awake now, and you may see her. Do you have any questions, Mr. Sullivan?" I shook my head and uttered, "No." "Well," he added, "if any questions should arise, you can have me paged. I expect the results to be back in about an hour, and I will consult with you then." Without so much as a condolence or word of sympathy, he departed. I started toward the cubicle area when the female detective, a short brunette with a pinched face and close-set eyes, stepped in front of me to block my path. My first instinct was to push her out of my way, but before I could react, she said authoritatively, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but my partner and I need to speak to your wife first. For now, this is a criminal investigation, and we need to take a statement." I turned to look at Harry, who was approaching, shaking his head in frustration, but said to her firmly, "Let it go, Anderson. Joe can go in to see his wife for a few minutes, then we'll do the interview." Embarrassed at having been overridden, her face reddened, and she responded indignantly, "Harvey, you know the rules. If we let the husband in, he could taint the case by coaching or collaborating with his wife about her statement, which may later be used if there is a trial." I later learned that her name was Sandra Anderson, 27-year-old college grad with less than 5 years on the job, less than 1 year in the detective division, but with a very big hook in the way of an uncle who was the deputy mayor. When I was new on the department, there were only a handful of female cops, but one very rarely saw one since most, not all, had been taken under some superior officer's wing and put into clerical jobs that kept them out of harm's way. It may sound sexist, but I know of several plush assignments given to female cops in exchange for sexual favors. One such case involved an officer in my precinct whose wife, upon graduating the academy, was immediately assigned as an aide to a deputy chief. She was a very attractive blonde with big tits, and why her husband was never suspicious was beyond me, but it turns out he thought that the chief was trying to do him a favor by keeping his wife off the street. One day, several months into her assignment, the husband was detailed to drop evidence off to the police lab, which was located in the basement of our headquarters building. He thought he'd surprise his wife by taking her to lunch. When entering the boss's fourth-floor office, he was disappointed to see her desk empty and figured he had missed her. However, he decided to check with the chief in case she was just somewhere else in the building. Entering the office, he saw his wife in a passionate embrace with the chief's hand inside of her open blouse and her hand stroking him. Unfortunately, his first response was to draw his weapon and threaten to kill them both. Fortunately, he was smart enough not to pull the trigger and instead clubbed the chief over the head and then slapped the shit out of his wife. When the dust settled, the husband was forced to resign in lieu of assault charges. The deputy chief was forced to retire, and unbelievably, the wife was reassigned to another division and a year later was promoted to detective. But that was then, and this is now, when sexual harassment in the workplace is the popular catchphrase. The influx of women onto the force has increased exponentially, and although the blatant sexual liaisons have ended, women are, for the most part, receiving the lion's share of the plainclothes and detective assignments. Harvey replied sarcastically, "Look, Anderson, I was making felony collars before you were born, and as lead detective I'll call the shots. Joe Sullivan is a colleague, retired or not, and deserves some professional courtesy. If that ruffles your feathers, you can wait for me in the cafeteria or just go sit in the car, and if you want to report me, Feel free. I need a reason to retire anyhow." With that, Detective Anderson turned and walked away. When out of earshot, Harvey muttered to no one in particular, "Goddamned affirmative action. She couldn't find a gambler at a poker game. Go ahead, Joe. I'll give you 15 minutes while I finish up some paperwork from our last call." When I pulled back the curtain to Elaine's cubicle, she turned her head and, upon seeing that it was me, turned away and began to sob. Pulling up a chair, I sat silently and allowed her to regain some control. Of course, I felt sympathy seeing her in such distress, but honestly, I still felt more anger than empathy. She had deceived me by carefully not referring to the a-hole's gender and allowing me to answer the door, assuming that by not telling me she would minimize the amount of time for conflict and the time to dissuade her from her folly. Elaine was now trying to explain the situation to her husband. I couldn't look my husband in the eye, so I snapped my head around and just began to cry. I had wanted so much for him to be by my side, but now I didn't know what to say. How do I apologize for ignoring his objections and concerns and having wound up being used by a sexual predator like a piece of meat? In the light of day, I realized that it was a date. No matter how innocent my intentions were, I had gone out to dine and dance with a man who was not my husband. Several times while lying here, I had considered how I would have reacted if the situation were reversed and Joe had told me he was going out with Andy, and Andy turned out to be Andrea, a younger, more attractive woman who he wanted to reward for some reason or other. I knew the answer, and it terrified me. Joe's voice stirred me from my horrible recollections when he said, "Elaine, the detectives are going to be in here shortly to take a statement from you, so you should be prepared that some of the questions will be embarrassing and intrusive. However, if your claim that the sex was due to your mental incapacity because of drugs or excessive alcohol, you should just answer truthfully. I have to tell you, Elaine, that if you try to deceive them in any way, they'll know." The lead detective has over 30 years of experience and is a skilled interrogator. He'll see right through any attempt at deception. He spoke in such a detached manner that the only words that resonated with me were claim and possible deception. And aside from that, he had not even touched me. There was no sympathy in his voice, and he sounded more like a damned lawyer than my husband. Even through my tears, I felt my anger rise, and finally looking at him, I snapped, "Joe, you sound like you don't believe me. I wouldn't talk to anyone until you got here because you have known me for over 20 years, and know that even though what I did was stupid, I never intended to have sex, much less expected to be sexually assaulted by someone I respected and considered a friend. Damn it, Joe, I wasn't seduced by that monster. I was drugged and used. I guess you don't see it that way though. So why don't you just leave and go be with your cop friends?" I turned my head away, too angry even to cry, as I heard his chair scrape against the tile floor, and without another word, I heard the privacy curtain open and close. I knew he was gone, probably for good. Meanwhile, Joe was still trying to control his emotions. When I went back into the waiting room, Harvey looked up questioningly. His indignant partner was sitting on the other side of the room with her arms folded over her merger chest with a petulant scowl on her face. "Thanks, Harvey," I said, sincerely knowing he could get jammed up for what he just did for me. "You can go in now, but just for the record, I intentionally elicited an angry response from her, and I believe she is telling the truth." He nodded, and with a nonverbal signal to his partner, she reluctantly trudged in behind him to the cubicle. About 45 minutes later, Harvey and his partner had still not emerged when I saw Dr. Nadell looking around the now crowding waiting room. When he saw me, he signaled for me to follow him, and we entered a small exam room down the hall from the ER. After we both were seated, he addressed me in a less clinical tone than earlier, saying, "The lab tests have come back, and they showed a significant amount of rohypnol and ketamine in her blood. As I'm sure you know as a former police officer, these are commonly referred to as data salt drugs, and in combination have the effect of both lowering inhibitions and increasing libido, but also somewhat paralyzing the body's communication ability between the brain and muscles. This makes resistance difficult, if not impossible." I have explained this to the detectives and gave them a copy of the chemical analysis. I have started an IV to help expedite the purge of her system, but she will be able to be released in about 3 hours. He stood and extended his hand, adding, "I am very sorry that you and your wife have to go through this, but under the circumstances, I think that time and maybe some counseling will help her, and you, fully recover." As he started to turn to leave, I stood and said, "Doctor, can I ask you a few questions?" He seemed a bit uncomfortable having completed what he considered his official task as attending physician, but nodded reluctantly. I think he may have anticipated my questions, which added to his discomfort. "I understand about the drugs and their effects, but what I'd like to know, actually need to know is, do the drugs prevent a woman from experiencing sexual pleasure?" He let out an exasperated sigh and motioned me to sit as he resumed his chair and, in a patient, but not unsympathetic way, he stated. Mr. Sullivan, I cannot answer that with any degree of certainty, but I can say that when a body's sexual organs are sufficiently stimulated, the body can react to that stimulation, but the brain may not. So, the body's reaction is strictly physiological. There may be no voluntary cerebral or emotional participation in such cases as this. To answer your veiled question of whether your wife may have experienced climax, yes, it is quite possible. Even victims who have not been drugged and have been forcibly assaulted have sometimes reported to have climaxed. Actually, that fact often adds to their ordeal, is that their body betrayed them and they received physical pleasure from an unwanted incident. Remember that whether drugged or physically forced, the reaction is still involuntary, just as it is to pain. He patted my shoulder, stood and walked away, probably thankful that I had no more difficult questions to besiege him with. I hadn't noticed that Harvey and his partner were standing near the entrance to the treatment area, apparently awaiting the doc's departure. As Harvey approached me, his partner glanced at me with seemingly less hostility than earlier, but did not join us, opting to allow Harvey to deliver whatever good or bad news he had. He began by saying, "Joe, you've got 20 years of police work under your belt, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence by outlining our procedures. First, let me say that I'm sorry for you and especially for your missus. Between her statement and the lab report, I have no doubt that she was drugged, and due to her inability to give consent, she was effectively assaulted. The perp probably slipped her a Mickey when she went to the ladies' room. She was completely unaware of his intentions and does not recall a significant portion of the assault. Now for the hard part, it kills me to say it, and if I were saying it to a stranger, it would be a significant breach of protocol and one that could see me charged with malfeasance. For the sake of your family, especially your wife, I would not recommend perusing charges against this scumbag." I started to protest, but he stopped me by quickly interjecting, "Hear me out, Joe, whatever you decide. I'll back you up. You know better than most what a sham our legal system can be. If the prick gets even a halfway decent lawyer, he's first going to allude to the fact that your wife intentionally went on a date with this guy. Yeah, I know she unintentionally blindsided you." She explained in detail the circumstances. However, to a jury, the fact that she went out to have dinner, drinks, and go dancing would go a long way towards an acquittal. As for the drugs, the defense is going to argue that she took them voluntarily in order to decrease her inhibitions. There is already case law on this, Joe. Not only in this jurisdiction but across the country, some women have used these drugs on themselves. They are also going to argue that when she realized how much time had elapsed while she was in the room, that she realized her marriage could be in jeopardy and she concocted a story and went to the hospital only to cover her sins and try to save her marriage. I don't have to tell you how ruthless attorneys can be. They will drag you both in the mud, and the local press will portray you as a permissive husband and her as being a promiscuous wife and by extension a lousy mother. There will be repercussions for your son from his peers, and in the end the douchebag will probably walk. Joe, you should talk to your wife, get her input, because in the end she has to make the decision. But, Joe, I'll have to get an answer before I leave here. I can write this up as an errant wife who was led astray and got caught, and the report will never see the light of day. After 30 years, I'm owed a lot of favors both by the department and the DA's office, so there will be no worries about charges of her filing a false police report. At first, Elaine was hysterical at the suggestion that her assailant could get away scot-free. She screamed that no one believed her, not the doctor, the cops, or even her husband. I grabbed her hand, but she jerked it away and began to sob. I held her hand again, but this time wouldn't let go when she tried to yank it away. Elaine, everyone believes you. Everyone. This is not about believing you. This is about an unfortunate reality. This is not about giving that scumbag a free pass. It's about sparing you the embarrassment and indignity of a public trial. Not one that will just be confined to a courtroom, but also in the local media. If there were even a 50-50 chance that we could win, I wouldn't even suggest this. But in reality, it's not even close to that. In the end, she begrudgingly gave in. I think more to spare Tommy the embarrassment than herself. As promised, Harvey buried the story and we never heard from the DA. Unfortunately, all stories do not have a happy ending, and ours is one such story. The counseling for both of us was emotionally difficult, especially as she described the one specific encounter that she remembered, and how when she opened her eyes when she had thought it was me having sex with her, but even when she saw that was him and not me, she was in the throes of a climax and continued to screw him. The therapist tried to justify her reaction by asking me, "Joe, if you were in a similar situation and you began to climax, would you be able to remove your Johnny from the woman's mouth or down there? Or back there?" I added sarcastically. From the corner of my eye, I saw Elaine wince at the innuendo. I took a moment before replying. "First of all, Doc, I wouldn't put myself in such a vulnerable position. so the point is moot. But since the question is theoretical, my answer is yes. We both tried hard over the next 8 months to salvage the relationship, but in the end, it was like frosty, melting away until the head finally rolled off and broke apart. Oddly enough, I had gotten to a point where I had all but forgotten about the sex. It was the image of her descending those stairs, reaching up to kiss his cheek, and the last defiant glance she gave me as she allowed him to put his arm around her and walk her out of the door and, in retrospect, out of my life. "Oh," she explained, how she was angry and did it just to tweak my nose a bit. But just the fact that she wanted to hurt me that way was more than I could overcome. The disrespect, betrayal, and the lying was too much. I had warned her about the consequences that might happen, but she chose to ignore and proceed. In short, she made her bed. I won't sleep with her in that bed. She would have to sleep alone. It has been 2 years since our mutually tearful divorce. I gave Elaine the house until Tommy is 18 or graduates college, but in truth, I'll probably just give it to her in either case. I have a pension and a profitable business, and she eventually received a $250K from the company, even though they denied any wrongdoing. However, she did receive small measure of revenge on Conrad Hunter. Although we were advised by our attorney that a civil suit was probably not viable, our attorney did submit our notarized statements along with a copy of the drug report, which, of course, the maggot vehemently denied having any part of. However, there had been 2 sexual harassment complaints against him at his previous branch office that had been either intentionally or unintentionally overlooked. Another female employee had complained of him having fondled her while in the break room. The other was a married female employee who had requested a transfer to a city where her husband was being reassigned to. Hunter told her that with his influence he could ensure her transfer if she would just give him a BJ. Neither charge could be substantiated, and even though Elaine's charge was in the same, she said, category, the company was apparently tired of him exposing them to possible lawsuits. He not only didn't get his promotion to London, but was terminated which meant no letter of recommendation after 12 years of service. The company just gave Elaine the money to avoid public embarrassment and a costly lawsuit. We both regret that our marriage was not salvageable, but realized the futility of continuing a charade that was having deleterious effects on our son. As far as I know, neither of us dated for over a year, but Elaine has been seeing someone fairly frequently as of late. He is a few years younger than her and was widowed at an early age. He seems like a stand-up guy, and on rare occasions when we meet, he goes out of his way to be friendly. However, it is difficult to forget the 19 years of intimacy with a wife, so at first, although polite, I was cool to his overtures of friendliness, but my jealousy has abated little by little, and now I do wish them well. My softening attitude, I'm sure, has much to do with the woman I am currently seeing. Alicia was a customer for several home improvements in the past and was awarded a divorce over a year ago when her abusive alcoholic husband went on a tirade which landed her in the hospital with a concussion and fractured collarbone. Her 14-year-old son, Kevin, and I have become quite close, and I have included him on several recent outings with Tommy. The boys seem to really hit it off, and although my relationship with Alicia has become intimate, we maintain separate residences, both for appearance of propriety for the boys, but also we're still a little gun-shy regarding marriage. Time will tell. Now for the part that I had always kept hidden. While Elaine had her revenge on Conrad, mine was yet to come. During my years in police service, I have met a lot of people, good, bad, and downright ugly. But sometimes you meet a person who is downright ugly but has a moral compass in certain matters. One such man was Mario. He was an Irish mob enforcer. I had arrested him 3 times for assault charges, but all 3 times, he got free. I met him 3 months after the incident with my wife. He met me like a long-lost friend, and we discussed about life. 5 days later, he called and asked to meet me at a local bar. I met him, and once we were done with the drinks, he asked me to accompany him to the parking. When we reached his car, he said, "There is a gift for you." He opened his trunk, and there was a small bag. Inside, there was a small jar, like the ones you see in a school biology lab. He pointed his phone's light on it. It contained what looked like a male organ and 2 testicles. "Your wife's tormentor shall never show his face to woman again." "Oh, don't worry, he is alive. We made sure he is alive. He just won't be the big man anymore." I had no words for Mario. I shook his hand and went home. At times, life gets you gifts out of nowhere. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.